There are certain objects that should never be desired. Some promise wealth, some promise power, and some promise something far more dangerous: the ability to change what has already been decided. But fate does not surrender easily. When a person attempts to rewrite it, fate may obey. It may grant exactly what was requested, yet it will choose the method and it will collect the payment. This is the story of the White family and the three wishes of the monkey's paw. So let's get into it, shall we? On a cold and rain-filled evening, Laburnum Villa stood alone at the end of a narrow road. The house was small, comfortable, and isolated from the nearest town. Outside, the wind pushed through the trees and struck the windows as though something wandered through the darkness, searching for shelter. Inside, however, the fire burned brightly. Mr. White sat at a table across from his adult son Herbert. Between them rested a chessboard. Mr. White enjoyed taking risks during their games. He would move his most important pieces into dangers simply because he found cautious play boring. Herbert examined the board and smiled. Herbert said check. Rather than responding immediately, Mr. White looked toward the window and said, "The wind is getting worse." Herbert moved another piece and said check again. Mrs. White sat near the fireplace, knitting, while secretly watching the game. She could already see that her husband had placed himself in a nearly impossible position. Mr. White studied the board. He moved his king. Herbert immediately moved one of his pieces and said, "Checkmate." Mr. White laughed quietly. Mr. White leaned back into his chair and complained that the road outside was practically flooded. He said he did not understand why anyone would choose to live so far from town. Mrs. White reminded him that he had been the one who wanted the house. Mr. White was preparing a response when three firm knocks sounded from the front door. The family fell silent. Then Mr. White stood and said, "That must be Sergeant Major Morris." He hurried through the hallway and opened the door. A burst of cold wind entered the house, followed by a broad-weathered man wearing a heavy coat. Sergeant Major Morris had served in the military for more than 20 years. During that time, he traveled across distant countries, witnessed battles, and survived dangers that he rarely discussed in detail. Mr. White warmly welcomed his old friend inside. Morris removed his coat and sat near the fire, while Mr. White poured him a drink. For some time, Morris entertained the family with stories about his travels. He spoke of crowded cities, unfamiliar temples, soldiers crossing endless stretches of land, and nights spent beneath the foreign stars. Herbert listened with great interest, while Mrs. White occasionally stopped knitting. Mr. White watched his friend with the fascination of someone whose own life had remained peaceful and ordinary. Eventually, Mr. White remembered something that Morris had mentioned during an earlier visit. Mr. White said, "What was that strange object you once told me about? Was it a monkey's paw?" The moment the question was asked, Morris's expression changed. He lowered his drink and stared into the fire. Morris said, "It is nothing worth hearing about." Herbert laughed and said, "This only made him more curious." Mr. White asked Morris to show it to him. For several seconds, Morris did not move. The fire cracked. The wind pressed against the house. At last, Morris reached into his coat pocket and removed a small object. He placed it upon the table. It was the dried paw of a monkey. The skin had darkened with age. The fingers were bent inward, as though the creature had died while attempting to hold something that could not be seen. Mrs. White pulled away from the table and said, "That thing is disgusting." Herbert leaned closer and asked what made it so special. Morris explained that an old holy man in India had placed a spell upon the paw. The holy man believed that fate controlled every person's life and that anyone who attempted to interfere with fate would suffer for it. To prove this lesson, he enchanted the paw so that 3 different owners could each receive 3 wishes. Mrs. White looked at the object doubtfully. She asked why such a powerful object was not famous. Morris replied that people spoke proudly about treasures they discovered, but they rarely spoke about the objects that ruined their lives. Mr. White asked whether the first owner's wishes had truly been granted. Morris said that they had. Herbert then asked what the first owner's wishes were. Morris said he did not know the man's first 2 wishes. He only knew the third. The final wish, he had wished for death. No one laughed after that. Mr. White slowly asked, "And you became the second owner?" Morris admitted that he had. Mr. White asked whether Morris had used all 3 wishes. Morris said that he had. Herbert asked what he had wished for. Morris did not answer. He stared into the flames with the expression of a man remembering something he desperately wanted to forget. Eventually, Morris said, "I received what I asked for. That is all I will say." Mr. White asked why he continued to carry the paw if it had caused so much suffering. Morris explained that he had considered selling it, but no sensible person believed the story, and those who did wanted to test the paw before paying anything. Then, without warning, Morris grabbed the paw and threw it directly into the fireplace. Mr. White quickly reached toward the flames with a pair of iron tongs. He pulled the paw out before it could burn. Morris told him to throw it back. Mr. White said, "You no longer want it. Why should I not keep it?" Morris replied, "Because I know what it does." Mr. White argued that perhaps Morris had simply made poor wishes. Morris stared at him and said that every owner eventually believed the same thing. He warned Mr. White that if he kept the object, whatever followed would be his own responsibility. Mr. White asked how the wishes were made. Morris reluctantly explained that the owner must hold the paw in their right hand and speak the wish clearly. He then advised Mr. White that, if he was determined to use it, he should wish for something modest and sensible. Later that evening, Morris prepared to leave. At the door, he once again argued Mr. White to destroy the paw. Mr. White promised that he would think about it. Morris replied that thinking about it and destroying it, actually destroying it, were not the same thing. Then he stepped into the storm and disappeared down the road. The White family returned to the fire. The paw remained on the table without Morris sitting beside it. The object appeared smaller and less threatening. Mrs. White asked whether her husband had paid Morris for it. Mr. White admitted that he had given him a small amount of money. Morris had initially refused, but Mr. White had insisted. Herbert joked that his father had paid to bring a dead animal's hand into their home. Mr. White picked up the paw and said he could not think of anything he genuinely needed. Herbert reminded him that there was still money he owed on the house. He said, "Wish for £200. That should be enough to finish off paying for it." The amount was not a fortune. It was not enough to transform the family members into a wealthy, upper-class citizen. It was simply enough to remove one burden from their lives. Herbert sat at the piano and played a dramatic chord. He told his family that the magical ceremony was ready to begin. Mrs. White laughed. Mr. White felt foolish, but he had the paw in his right hand. He looked toward his family. Then he said, "I wish for 200 pounds." Mr. White suddenly cried out and dropped the paw. Mrs. White rushed toward him and asked what had happened. Mr. White said the object had moved. He explained that it had twisted inside his hand like a living creature. Herbert picked it up and examined it. The paw remained completely still. Herbert joked that he did not see any money. He suggested that perhaps the 200 pounds would fall from the ceiling and kill his father. Rather morbid. Mrs. White told Herbert to stop frightening him. The family attempted to laugh about the incident, but the room no longer felt as comfortable as it had been before the wish. That night, after his wife and son went to bed, Mr. White remained by the fireplace. The flames slowly weakened. The shadows moved along the walls. As Mr. White stared into the dying coals, he began imagining faces within them. Some appeared human, others did not. For one brief moment, he thought he saw the face of a monkey staring through the fire. Its dark eyes watched him, its lips pulled back from small teeth. Mr. White quickly reached for a glass of water. Instead, his fingers touched the paw. He threw it away from himself, extinguished the lamp, and hurried upstairs. The following morning was bright and clear. The fears from the previous night seemed foolish beneath the sunlight. The paw rested on a shelf, looking like nothing more than an unpleasant souvenir. Herbert prepared to leave for work at the Ma and Megan's manufacturing company. Before leaving, Herbert asked whether the 200 pounds had arrived during the night. Mr. White told him that it had not. Herbert said that perhaps the magical money was only delivered during normal banking hours. Mrs. White told him not to tease his father. Herbert put on his coat, kissed his mother, and walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, he looked back and said, "Do not spend the money before I return." Those were the last words his parents ever heard him speak. The day continued normally. Mrs. White completed her household work. Mr. White occasionally looked through the window toward the road. Whenever Mrs. White noticed, she teased him for expecting a mysterious stranger to arrive with their money. By the afternoon, even Mr. White had begun to accept that Pa had no power. Then Mrs. White noticed a man standing outside the gate. He wore formal clothing and carried a polished hat in his hands. The man walked toward the house, then he stopped. He turned around as though he had changed his mind. Several moments later, he returned and slowly approached the door. Mrs. White opened the door. The stranger asked whether she was Mrs. White. She said that she was. The stranger explained that he had been sent by Ma and Megan's, the company where Herbert worked. Mrs. White's expression immediately changed. She asked whether something had happened to her son. The man looked away and requested permission to come inside. He entered the parlor, but did not sit down. He continued holding his hat tightly between his hands. Mrs. White again asked what had happened to Herbert. The man said that he had been in an accident. Mrs. White asked whether Herbert had been injured. The representative replied, "He was badly injured, but he is no longer in pain." For one brief second, Mrs. White appeared relieved. Then she understood what his words meant. Mr. White reached for her hand. He asked the representative how Herbert had died. The man explained that Herbert had been caught inside one of the large machines at the factory. The clock continued ticking. The fire continued burning. Outside, people continued walking along the road. The entire world carried on as though nothing had happened. Mr. White quietly said, "He was our only son." The representative expressed his sympathy. He had explained that the company accepted no legal responsibility for the accident. However, Ma and Megan's wish to provide the family with a payment in recognition of Herbert's service. Mr. White stared at the man. He asked, "How much?" The representative lowered his eyes. Then he answered, £200. Mrs. White screamed, while Mr. White stood and reached into the air as though the room had disappeared around him. Then he collapsed. The paw had granted his wish. It had not created the money. It had arranged a payment, £200, exactly enough for the house in which their son would never live again. Herbert was buried in a cemetery, approximately 2 miles from Laburnum Villa. The funeral ended. The visitors left. The flowers placed near his grave began to fade. Mr. and Mrs. White returned to a house that now felt painfully empty. At first, their grief filled every room. Then the days passed. Even their grief seemed to grow exhausted. Mr. White stopped playing chess. Mrs. White left Herbert's chair untouched. Sometimes one of them would begin speaking, forgetting for a moment that the person they intended to address was gone. Then silence would return. Approximately 10 days after the funeral, Mr. White awoke during the night. The bedroom was dark. His wife was no longer lying beside him. Mrs. White stood near the window crying quietly. Mr. White told her to return to bed before she became cold. Mrs. White looked toward the distant cemetery and replied, "Our son is colder." Mr. White could not answer her. He closed his eyes and attempted to sleep. Then, Mrs. White suddenly stopped crying. She turned away from the window. She said, "The paw." Mr. White asked what she meant. Mrs. White said, "The monkey's paw, where is it?" Mr. White told her that he believed it was downstairs. Mrs. White hurried toward the bed and grabbed his shoulders. Her eyes were filled with a strange and desperate hope. She reminded him that he had made only one wish. There were still 2 remaining. Mr. White immediately understood. He said, "No." Mrs. White told him to use the second wish to bring Herbert back. Mr. White begged her to think about what she was asking. Mr. White insisted that the paw had taken their son and that it could return him. Mr. White argued that Herbert's death and the payment might have been a terrible coincidence. Mrs. White asked why he was suddenly refusing to believe after being so frightened by the first wish. She commanded him to go downstairs and retrieve the paw. Mr. White then revealed something he had not told her. The factory had not allowed Mrs. White to see Herbert's body. Mr. White had been forced to identify him. He had recognized his son only by the clothing he wore. The machinery had damaged Herbert so severely that his own father could barely look at him. Mr. White reminded his wife that Herbert had now been buried for 10 days. He asked her to imagine what the paw might bring back. Mrs. White said, "He is still my child." Mr. White replied, The creature that returns may not be the child you remember. Mrs. White asked whether he believed she could be afraid of her own son. Mr. White said, "I am afraid of what the paw may consider our son." Mrs. White stared at him. Then she said, "Bring him back." Mr. White pleaded to her. Mrs. White's grief turned to anger. She ordered him to retrieve the paw and return her child. Mr. White lit a candle and slowly descended the stairs. The house was completely dark below. He entered the parlor and searched the mantel with one shaking hand. His fingers touched dust, a picture frame, a candle holder, and then the dried paw. For a moment, he imagined that something was already standing behind him. He pictured a broken figure waiting in the darkness, breathing quietly and hoping to be recognized. Mr. White forced himself to return upstairs. Mrs. White held out her hand and ordered him to make the wish. Mr. White said that what they are doing was wrong. Mrs. White replied, "Wish my son alive again." Mr. White raised the paw. His voice trembled as he said, "I wish Herbert were alive again." Nothing happened. Mrs. White rushed to the window. The road outside was empty. The cemetery remained 2 miles concealed within the darkness. Several minutes passed. The candle burned lower. No footsteps approached the house. No voice called from the road. So that's part 1 of the story. If you actually enjoyed this, please subscribe, like, and send me a comment. This video took an abnormal amount of time, so give me some love and tell me if you want more.